Welcome to this webinar, which is part of the Children's Policy Centre webinar series in conversation with commissioners, or in conversation with children's commissioners. I'm Sharon Bessell. I'm Professor of Public Policy at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, and I'm Director of the Children's Policy Centre. I'm in the south of Canberra at the moment on Ngunnawal land. This land has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations peoples who might be joining us for this webinar. The Children's Policy Centre is based at the ANU, and we have three key objectives. First, to undertake innovative interdisciplinary research on a range of issues relating to children's policy. Second, to seek to connect researchers, policymakers and practitioners working on a range of issues to promote the human rights, the well-being and the best interests of children. And third, we aim to communicate research findings and to contribute to better outcomes for children and for young people. And of course, this webinar series is a central part of that. And today I am delighted to be joined by two commissioners, Jodie Griffiths-Cook and Luke Twyford. Zoe Robinson, the New South Wales Advocate for Children and Young People, was to join us, but unfortunately she's unable to do so. But we're so pleased to be talking with Jodie and Luke. Let me just introduce each of them. I think many of the people in the audience probably know you both, Luke and Jodie, but I'll just do some introductions. Jodie Griffiths-Cook is both the ACT Public Advocate and the ACT Children and Young People's Commissioner. As Public Advocate, Jodie advocates for the rights and interests of children, young people and adults experiencing vulnerability, as well as oversight in child protection, youth justice, and mental health and forensic mental health services. Additionally, part of her job as Children and Young People's Commissioner involves talking with children and young people about the things that are important to them, as well as getting other people to listen and to understand what children and young people say about important issues, especially when they are making decisions that impact on children and young people. Jodie uses what she hears to let government, service providers, parents and carers and other people in the community know what they can do to act differently and to better support children and young people in the ACT. With over 25 years experience in human services, Jodie is committed to doing everything she can to promote a child-safe, child-friendly Canberra. Jodie, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Sharon.
Luke Twyford is Principal Commissioner and Chief Executive of the Queensland Family and Child Commission. Luke joined the Commission in January 2022, and he brings with him to that role a wealth of experience. Luke's career spans more than 20 years experience with the Commonwealth, the New South Wales and the Northern Territory governments in the areas of reform, research and evidence, integrity, audit governance and complaints management. Prior to joining the Queensland Family and Child Commission, Luke worked for 9 years with the Northern Territory Government, leading critical reform of the child protection system and its legal frameworks. This included legislating a Charter of Rights for Children in Care, such incredibly important work, and leading reform in family support and out-of-home care programs to empower children and families to reduce abuse, neglect and youth crime. He was also responsible for monitoring the performance of the Child Safety Department and delivering projects to improve systems designed to keep children in care safe. Luke's parents fostered a number of children throughout his childhood, with his own lived experience and those of his foster brothers and sisters profoundly shaping the perspective that Luke brings to his work and his passion in advocating for the rights and well-being of children and young people. Luke, great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
So today we are talking about how we can put children at the centre. And of course, everything that you do as commissioners is around putting children at the centre. As we begin, I wonder if I could ask each of you to just briefly outline your role. I've done a little bit of that in the intro, but there's obviously more to the role than that intro suggests. And as we've held these conversations with commissioners, it's been really interesting to see just how different the roles can be across the different jurisdictions in Australia, but also where the similarities are. So perhaps if you could just briefly outline what it is you do. Luke, maybe we could begin with you.
Sure, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, which to acknowledge that. And as you said, I worked for many years on the lands of the Larrakia people in Darwin, and have my family roots on the Ngunnawal land in Canberra. So we have a connection there, Jodie. Very interesting to ask a Children's Commissioner what their role is, and it's such a simple but complex answer that I need to give. And really talking to the staff here, it's separated into three key areas. So one is awareness raising, and that is our role in collecting views, sharing best practice research, talking to people with lived experience and amplifying their perspectives and their opinions and stories. So a real role around community awareness raising, but also awareness raising to government and to policy decision makers. Secondly is advocacy, and it links closely to awareness raising, but that is finding or identifying areas where we believe things need to change and advocating for that change. We do that through policy papers, presentations and submissions to parliamentary select committees, open letters at points in time to journalists and ministers, but that sense that a commission should be advocating for change. And then finally, what is, I think, a traditional view of a Children's Commissioner, and that's the accountability piece. So monitoring, evaluating, analysing the performance of government departments, particularly traditionally the Child Protection Department, around what are the trends and what is the evidence around where the risk, failings and success might be, and what can we learn from that. So three clear functions, I would say, and often blurred. And then finally, a point of interest, I think, for myself is I'm also the chair of the Child Death Review Board. So I receive notices of all the children and young people under 18 who have passed away in Queensland, and particularly have to analyse those for emerging trends and patterns with a clear focus on how could we prevent preventable child deaths.
Thanks, Luke. It is such a range of roles that you play and that many of the commissioners play. And so often resources are an issue, but such phenomenally important work. Jodie, can you talk us through what your role involves?
Sure. Yuma, hello everyone, in the language of the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm currently on. Luke, we have an even bigger connection. I lived and worked many of my professional years on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, but I was born on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations in Ferntree Gully, Victoria. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly to recognise, I guess, the importance of culture and cultural connection and family. To not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, but the importance that culture plays to all of us more broadly within Australia as we work towards reconciliation. As Sharon provided in what I realised was quite a long-winded introduction, my apologies, I'll seek to shorten that one next time. I do wear two statutory hats, one of Public Advocate and one of Children and Young People Commissioner. I'll start with, I think, something that represents the best example of the dichotomy of those two roles. And it was rather early on in my tenure in these roles. And I found myself in the morning in Youth Justice Court, monitoring, observing what was happening and interjecting where needed in some of the matters that were raised there, to sitting in the afternoon in a ball pit with a 3-year-old having an intense conversation about why this was just the best thing ever. And I think that really represents the breadth of the two roles that I have. So certainly in my public advocate hat, we have a key role both in terms of systems advocacy and, as Luke said, trying to get shifts and changes where we're seeing that things aren't working right, but also through applying that systemic lens to our individual advocacy, where we're acting on behalf of children and young people, either directly or indirectly, in courts, tribunals, care team meetings, whatever forum might be required. We also have that key oversight role, which you referenced as well, over in particular child protection and youth justice when it comes to children and young people matters, but increasingly so, and particularly, and I know we'll talk about this a bit later, but off the back of COVID, some of the trends we're seeing in terms of mental health as well, and the impact that's having on children and young people. As Children and Young People Commissioner, I have a fairly discrete range of functions that are, I shouldn't say the funnest part of my role. Both parts can be fun, but they almost exclusively relate to the responsibility to consult directly with children and young people, to ascertain their views about things that adults want to know, but more importantly, to find out about the things that are important to children and young people, irrespective of whether that's on the public policy landscape or not. And then using that, as you've mentioned, Sharon, to really try and push and promote and change and shift and, you know, win the hearts and minds of those who are in key decision-making roles, to see that those issues, I guess, are given some precedence, I guess, in the development of policy. The other part that I'll briefly touch on before I'll hand back to you, Sharon, is one of the key, it's a fairly unique role that we have, in that as part of the Human Rights Commission here in the ACT, we get to see any piece of proposed legislation, legislative amendments, cabinet and policy documents, etc., that go through our legislative assembly here, and have the ability, therefore, where we see it's needed, to influence those both through a children's rights lens, but also through that understanding of what we're hearing from children and young people, where we can find appropriate places to use that in our feedback to those processes. And, you know, that is something that is relatively unique to our jurisdiction, but certainly serves as a really important source of influence in terms of being able to make sure that that lens and the rights and interests and well-being, in fact, of children and young people are considered, even in those submissions that, you know, people might not necessarily immediately think children and young people have a place here. So I think that's a really important role as well, or part of the role.
Jodie, thank you. That's a fantastic overview. And I think, you know, we often think about children's issues and children's human rights in Australia, and we still have a very long way to go to ensure that we secure the rights and the best interests of all children in Australia. But when I look across just the fact that we have commissioners for children and young people in every jurisdiction and at the national level, and the work that you do, I'm also reminded of just how far we've come and how strong some of the systems are that we have in place. So, you know, I think, you know, hearing what you do is such a great foundation for the conversation that we're about to have. And I would just say to people who have joined us that there will be time for comments and questions if people would like to ask them. I'll ask that people put their questions into the Q&A rather than the chat. There are lots of people here, and there's some great conversations going on within the chat, but I'm going to miss the questions if they're there. So please pop your questions into the Q&A, or when we get to that part of the conversation, yes, just let me know if you would like me to hand the mic over to you, or if you'd like me to read a question for you. I want to ask about the role that young people play in shaping your work, but before we do, Jodie, I just wanted to pick up on that role of yours around the review of legislation, or to comment on legislation, because as you say, that's a unique function and something that's very important. And I know we've got people from joining us from across Australia. Could you just say a little bit more about how the Human Rights Act operates, how it gives you that role in the ACT? And what kinds of policies you're able to comment on? Are they only policies that are seen as relating to children, or are they broader than that?
Yeah, look, they're certainly broader than that, because as a commission, and again, we've got a semi-uniqueness to the structure here, in that alongside my two roles, I sit alongside the President, who's also the Human Rights Commissioner, the Victims of Crime Commissioner, and the Commissioner of longest title, who is the Discrimination, Health Services, Disability and Community Services Commissioner. I think there's 3 different roles caught up in that one. So there are overall 8 different statutory roles that are part of our commission here. We see everything that goes through the cabinet bag, and I guess the lens that I apply to that is not just the children's rights lens, but also because of the role that I have in adults matters for our mental health, forensic mental health and complex needs disability portfolios. We're casting a fairly broad lens over that, and also being very aware of the intersectionality of those challenges, conditions, situations that people find themselves in, alongside, things like poverty and homelessness and all of those other myriad of issues that can increase vulnerability. If I was to give an example that I think best demonstrates how, as a whole commission, we worked together to drive advocacy, was probably the proposal to raise the minimum age of criminal responsibility, which many will know is gaining some traction here in the ACT. And in fact, there is a commitment to consider that, an activity that's underway to move that from just being a consideration to actually a practical implementation. Our process there, apart from all the bits that happened behind the scenes, we were able to pull together a submission that gave a really solid balancing of children's rights alongside of, and recognising, I guess, that children, even if they are identified as being the perpetrator in a particular situation, still hold vulnerability and often are also victims in their own right. So not only that children's rights lens of understanding development and what that means when you're 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old upwards, but balancing all of that against the fact that children are also victims, but that we also need to be able to understand and respond to the needs of victims, even if the action of a child may no longer be considered a criminal action. And I think that's a really important distinction as other states and territories interrogate the minimum age of criminal responsibility. That doesn't take away from the ability to look at systems that can still support a child to understand that their actions may have been wrong, but to take that down a pathway that is a supportive one and that ultimately and ideally places them on a trajectory that isn't one of youth justice into adult criminal justice, but actually is one that supports them to contribute constructively and to have that kind of understanding and empathy that we're all striving to have, not just for ourselves, but for our children. So yeah, I think, by way of example, I guess that's probably the best one I could give at the moment, and certainly a current and contemporary one.
Thanks, Jodie. It's such an interesting model, and I think such a powerful model. It's good to hear about it. I wanted to ask each of you too about what role children and young people play in shaping the work that you do, either through youth advisory groups or consultations or other mechanisms. Luke, could you share a little bit with us of the role that children and young people play?
Absolutely, and I think you've named two right there that I was going to touch on, but I think the fundamental answer is they shape everything we do, and that has been a journey for the Commission prior to my arrival to get to a point where it is pervasive in the way we think about designing our work, commissioning work, implementing new items of work, and then completing them. So the Youth Advisory Council, a formal structure where young people across Queensland nominate and are chosen to be part of the QFCC Youth Advisory Council, has existed and evolved. Originally, it had a very small number of Queensland youth. It now has 25 active members who not only attend bi-monthly meetings with the commissioners, so myself and the commissioner, but also have their own projects. So making sure that we as a commission give young people who put their hand up an empowerment and an expectation that they can come and address their key issues or their areas of interest and provide us a body of work. It's moved, in my perspective, advisory council membership out of what could be a tokenistic participation into a real meaningful individual contribution from each advisory council member. Secondly, we do survey all Queensland youth at least every 2 years, and we call that body of work Growing Up in Queensland. We ask broad questions around young people and children's views of their community. Do they feel safe? Do they feel hopeful? What would make them more hopeful or less hopeful for the future? What do they think of their leaders? How is school going? So broad ranging questions to all Queensland youth. We know there's probably about 1 million young people or over, and around 8,000 responded to the last survey. So it's a small sample, but it is an opportunity we give, and not many other government departments give, to young people to have a broad ranging response on their life and what they think about their future. And then through our own work, the work that the Commission selects to do, whether we want to do a case read into the quality of practice in out-of-home care, or have a look at transport policy, we've moved into a serious question of how will young people shape this body of work. And it has led us to design the youth participation framework and a model of participation. It's now a published body of work. We created it for ourselves. It has 2 key pillars, but 4 elements. So the pillars are engagement and advocacy. In engagement, we're saying that young people need to be engaged in our work from start to finish. That requires us to connect and to support. So when a young person does want to connect with us, we need to question how we will support them through that process and make sure what we're asking for fits their needs. And then secondly, in that other pillar of advocacy, it's the 2 elements are advocacy, amplify and influence. So if a young person does want to advocate, we take on our duty then is to amplify what they are saying. So to add to their voice or to create a space for their voice, and then to ensure that that voice has influence. 6 years ago, if I just reflect nationally, there was a lot of conversation about listening to children. And I thought that was great at the time. But I think we've come to realize that listening isn't enough. We need to act. We need to not only act, but also to empower. Young people have views, but they are also very capable of policy design, grant funding, decision-making. And so that brings me to probably my last point, which is when you do start really questioning yourself about how young people can be engaged, the answers are everywhere. We've just completed a recruitment for a middle management role in our advocacy team, and we had a young person on the panel. So people who were interviewed had bureaucrats asking them questions, but they also had a Queensland young person on the panel asking them a question. I just thought that's a very clear way to show that young people can be engaged and can add value to almost any process.
Look, thank you. I think it's great to hear. I think the starting point has to be listening. But of course, moving beyond listening is just so important, and it's so powerful to hear what you're doing in Queensland. I think it was Roger Hart, who's famous for the ladder of participation that was around decades ago, who would talk of listening to children's voices with adults' ears. And I think that's always been part of the problem, and the fact that we're shifting away from always hearing with adults' ears is a really good thing. Jodie, would you like to talk a little bit about how you do it here in the ACT?
Yeah. Look, hats off to the QFCC for that piece of work. I've pored over it, and it's a fantastic document, but I think also a great framework and foundation for the action that then goes behind that. And I'd absolutely echo that point that listening isn't enough. If we don't add our weight to that or empower young people to create their own weight through supportive means, then I think we're not getting the most from that. We frequently talk about children and young people as being the experts in their own lives. And I think I'm a bit concerned at the moment. I'm watching this or hearing this phrase get bandied about in a way that I'm not sure people are truly understanding what that really means. And it's not just, again, it comes back to the, let's listen, it's like, no, let's understand. And then beyond understanding, let's see how we use that to drive action. We're always here looking for new ways to open dialogue and to, we maintain connections. We haven't got our own youth advisory council or group, and that's been a very deliberate decision, not because it wouldn't be useful, but because there are already a number of them that are used here in the ACT. And as a small jurisdiction, and those are on the chat, I know there's at least a couple from Tassie, in small jurisdictions, you can go overkill to the point where, you actually over-engage and then you start to lose some of the momentum. So we try to tap into some of those groups and, frequently, you know, have those conversations with them and use every bit of intel that comes, whether it's about, you know, the topic that we might be wanting to know about or the topics that they're raising. I always say here too, I think we've got this unique opportunity in a way. Children and young people make up about 1/4 of our overall population here in the ACT. They're the biggest single stakeholder group, unless you take adults as a single stakeholder group. And we rarely do. You know, we always separate adults into, you know, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people or culturally, linguistically diverse or people with disability. And not to say, obviously, that those same sub-cohorts exist within the stakeholder cohort of children and young people. But at the moment, we're still grappling with giving children and young people a place as a substantive stakeholder group. So, you know, while we absolutely try to tap into that diversity through all of the conversations we have, you know, a key issue for us is continuing to push and push and push for children and young people to be engaged directly as children and young people with all the nuances that then come from their diversity as well. In terms of sort of coming back to that question about, you know, what mechanisms do we use and things like that, one of the mechanisms that we've established in recent years, and it came off the back of a trial of a young thinker in residence, you know, we hosted a young person here for a period of time who has gone on to amazing things. At the moment, at the mere age of 18, I think she just turned 19. She's currently got a job with one of the senators, is doing a psych and law degree, and has recently moved out independently. At the time that she came and did her residency with us, she was struggling in many different ways, just trying to find that sense of identity and place, and seeking to understand what contribution, you know, she could make out there, despite having fabulous ideas. But, you know, the traction for those ideas just, you know, she wasn't gaining that. And look, you know, to be honest, I'd love to be able to take kudos for it, but she honestly drove it herself. We just gave her a place and some guidance and mentorship. And, you know, I think some of her standouts were presenting at, you know, a national conference in Queensland in 2018, 19. I'm trying to think what year that was now, where she facilitated a panel of young people and, you know, engaged them in bringing out their views and their experiences of care and protection systems in particular. But, you know, those kind of, you know, we went from that young thinker in residence, which just wasn't sustainable for those who, again, small jurisdiction. I only have 3 part-time staff working in under my commissioner role, so it just wasn't a sustainable thing for us. But we've created the Young Thinker Forum, which is an online forum that actually provides an opportunity for children and young people to use whatever medium they like. They can write if they wish to, they can draw, paint, record a video or audio recording, you know, whatever medium works for them in terms of expressing the issues or concerns or, you know, whatever passions that they want to raise with us. That forum provides the opportunity to do so. And where young people are interested in doing so, we also offer the opportunity to actually give, I guess, shine a spotlight on that. So where it's a written piece, an opinion piece, you know, we've created a bit of a template and we'll push that out, you know, with the, you know, not changing a word of what the young person has written, but push that out to those who potentially stand to be influenced by what that young person's view might be about that. In using that same forum, during lockdown last year, we created the Lockdown Legacies Art Competition. And, you know, if anyone's interested, you can go to our website, actkids.act.gov.au, to see the product of that. And look, and that in and of itself told us so much. There was so much, it was all art, obviously, and different manifestations of art. But you really got a sense of the impact of lockdown on children and young people, and using, I guess, that very different method of presentation. I think, you know, for some here in the ACT, those insights came from actually feeling what children and young people were communicating, not just reading it and going, yeah, that was great, thanks very much. But that sense of actual, yeah, what's underlying really came through. So yeah, and I guess, you know, I don't know, there's so much stuff I could say here. I love this part. But also, you know, working through mechanisms when we're doing major consultations, and we try to do a major consultation every couple of years. At the moment, we've got one running seeking to understand children and young people's experiences of racism. Our previous one was around their experiences of domestic and family violence. But both of those were developed with the input and were iterative in their design off the back of what we were learning from children and young people along the way. So it was that ongoing process of refinement in the way we were consulting to make sure that we were truly understanding what was being said to us, but also to make sure that the way we were approaching that was going to be appropriately child safe, appropriately child friendly. And by that, I also extend that obviously to youth safe and youth friendly, but a way that would make sure, you know, that children and young people walked away feeling not just that they'd been heard, but actually feeling that what they'd communicated was actually going to lead to a space of change. So yeah, lots of different ways. There's heaps more, and I'm sure if we had all of our colleagues from across the country here, we could probably take up the whole episode with this.
Jodie, I think that speaks so much to the different approaches you use to ensure that you reach, you know, the widest range of children and young people, and that you give different individuals with different interests the opportunity to engage on their own terms, you know, in a way that makes sense and is meaningful. But I wonder if you could just talk a little more, and I'll ask each of you the same question, about whether it's you use the same processes, whether you do things a little differently, and how you go about engaging with children and young people who, for want of a better way of putting it, might be the most marginalised, who perhaps have the greatest barriers between them and being able to engage and participate and share their views. Luke, maybe you could just talk us through how you think about those issues.
Yeah, and I think there's a real dichotomy, I guess, to the way you approach that. Certainly, we want to hear those voices, in particular in relation to our function around monitoring the performance of child safety services across Queensland. We are currently have 2 staff based in detention centres part-time with the specific purpose of them building relationships with youth detainees. Very poor title, I use that deliberately to make the point that sometimes we can label young people around their issue, and we then think that we understand them based on that label. So this specific project is about going in and hearing the real lived experience of young people who find themselves in that location. And it will ultimately result in a report that we will publish around changing the narrative and community awareness around what the media would call high-range youth offenders and youth troublemakers. So I use that as a specific example where we have chosen that cohort as the voice we need to hear, the voice that the community needs to hear. But we've been able to apply our practice, our youth participation framework, as we do for all projects. And it's that second pillar around support where there is really the main distinction. No matter which young person you're dealing with, you want to connect with them, and then you need to support that connection. Equally, some of our youth advisory council members have lived experiences that mean they require additional support when we broach certain topics. But in fact, it's those topics that those young people want to raise. And I think that's a real challenge for the community when things get sensitive or we approach what might be taboos. We, as the adults listening, get worried or overly worried, when in fact the young person really wants to tell their story and really wants change to happen. Recently, in my very first week in this role, there was a select committee on mental health, and 6 young people went to a private hearing of the committee to talk about their lived experience with mental health, both their own and those of their parents, and how that impacted on their lives. And I just reflected on that day that was a real watershed moment for me in terms of all the adults in the room absolutely honouring the lived experience of the young people and recognising that the young people were strong because of their lived experience and strong because of the voice they had. And our support was there and had been planned, but it was up to the young person to engage with and connect with the support or not. And it wasn't for us to pre-worry or to pre-predict in such a way that we'd shut down the conversation. And I think often bureaucrats can do that. And that's one of the big worries I have. The other point I think I'd make is the great challenge of enabling young people to connect with us in a way that they want to connect. I have worked in the bureaucracy, in the departments, and we think that circulating a 6-page written policy document to teenagers and asking them for feedback is the best way to get youth participation. Clearly it's not. Most teenagers don't want to read corporate policy documents and track change them. Some do, of course, but that's not the main. And so when we are talking about young people who have had trauma backgrounds or who are currently going through unpleasant situations, determining how they would best engage with us is a far better question for policymakers than how should we engage with them. And that's why I think we need to constantly have a range of tools available, whether it be a survey, whether it be a face-to-face meeting, whether it be a peer support network. And I will call out the Create Foundation there as one of the key organising partnerships that I've drawn on in the past, where the voice of children in out-of-home care can be amplified and acted upon in a very supportive way because it's coming via a trusted third party. So I think I'd probably stop on that point, but it is about diversity. You need a diversity of mechanisms to engage young people, but you need to be prepared to support the young person always, but not pre-predict and pre-worry to the point where you would not listen to a young person that wants to tell their story.
Sharon, I might pick up on that and add to that with an example that it was something we became very aware of as we started to enter into the domestic and family violence consultation a couple of years ago. And part of what we sought to try and understand at that very early stage of design was what might be some of the things that would hold a child or young person back from putting forward and talking about their experience. And obviously a key one when you're thinking about domestic and family violence was around the very real concern that children and young people rightly have, and we understood this before we started, that the minute they talk about something having happened at home, care and protection is going to be called in. And so, we undertook, even ahead of kicking that consultation off, to actually have a very frank conversation with our child and youth protection services here about what a supportive reporting framework might look like. One that, we are mandatory reporters, we can't shy away from that responsibility, but one that would actually allow any child or young person who might disclose to actually be in part of driving that process forward and informing the decision making about how it would go forward. In some ways, we never needed to call upon it, because I think it was really interesting. Children, young people, they're very savvy. They know how to navigate those mandatory reporting systems to make sure that you don't have to be using it. But I think more interestingly was the reflections we heard from children and young people about those systems, and it certainly backed up, those insights certainly backed up our understanding of why that was an important mitigation strategy to put in place, even though we didn't need to call upon it, or only in a couple of instances. I think it's interesting, that question of, marginalised. I think part of it is actually not just recognising what are some of the things that might stop children and young people from coming forward or speaking up, but also working with the communities that exist around them, not assuming that just because you're the commissioner, you're going to, automatically get someone going, sure, I'll tell you all about my life. Using our government and non-government partners, in particular the community agencies, and often going to those, places or groups or organisations that wouldn't be the, the typical ones. I would echo Luke, however, that Create are a fabulous organisation, and certainly we've equally drawn upon their support of young people. And I reflect on a very small-scale consultation I did with a group of Aboriginal children and young people in care early on in my tenure here. not only was that a really useful insight into some of the underlying systemic biases that we already knew existed, but to actually get, again, those direct, what does that mean for a child or young person who's in that care situation? But I think what was, most affirming for those, some of those children and young people, those who elected to take part, was we actually gave them a platform, and I facilitated a panel conversation with those children and young people as part of the SNAKE conference here in Canberra some years back. And so again, it was that way of how do you, and that was, there was a whole process that went behind that in terms of building, skill and a sense of worth that their story was a valid one that could only be best told through their own voices rather than through mine. And the questions of, but is anyone really going to listen to me? Is anyone really going to care what I have to say? And those were the very real concerns. And I think part of the challenge really is grappling with that. And I don't think that's just an issue for, that small group of Aboriginal children and young people I spoke to. That's a broader issue for children and young people more generally. It's like, well, no one ever listens anyway, so why the hell would I speak up? I've heard that, from young people in youth justice, in youth court, as much as I've heard it from, my own kids sometimes. But you never listen anyway.
Jodie,
that's an interesting challenge.
Jodie, there's such powerful examples, and I'm seeing some really great questions coming through in the Q&A. So I want to go to some of those questions now, and I'm going to jump around in order because some of them relate directly to the comments you both just made. There's a comment, someone asks, do we always need to re-traumatise young people through telling their story, or is there a better way that we can utilise their voice? And I wanted to make a point before I turn to you two on that. And I've done research with children and young people who've experienced out-of-home care. And one of the things that they say consistently is that they get sick of being required to tell their story again and again to different people who they don't know, who they don't choose to talk with, and who they may never see again. But they also say that they want to share their stories if people will listen, will take them seriously, will respond and validate those stories and act where they can. And often children and young people say they don't want to make decisions alone, but they want to be part of the decision-making process. So I think a lot of this speaks to exactly the kinds of things you two have been talking about in terms of the how we go about it. But I'd love to hear from each of you on that question. Luke, would you like to comment first?
Yeah, well, certainly we don't want to re-traumatise or indeed traumatise anyone. And that's why I think it's about creating safe spaces and invitations, but never requiring or coercing someone to tell their story. And I reflect back, you introduced me having grown up with my parents being foster carers. I didn't tell many people that when I was working in child protection. I thought that would be stigmatising to the work I was doing on reforming the out-of-home care system. I employed a number of care leavers who worked with me for many years before they told me they had grown up in the out-of-home care system. And talking to them, and I'm only using a case study to answer a question, it's not going to fit in every case. The conversations ultimately got to there is a sense of identity, right or wrong, and a sense of empowerment that can come from telling your story of how you grew up. And if that is a story that works for you as an individual in your passions and dreams and where you want your life to go, then please use that story. But if it's a story that causes you pain and suffering, then publicly sharing it isn't the right thing to do. And so it comes down to the individual to a degree, but also people who are creating platforms, such as a Children's Commissioner, to make sure it's a safe place and a place where people can easily opt out. And I think that's part of the trick in the work we do around youth advisory councils and yarn in circles. It's always having the ability for a person in the moment to disengage respectfully, safely, and with no judgment from us, so that when it is uncomfortable, that there's a exit with dignity, and it's okay and it's safe.
Yeah, look, I'll pick up on two. I think there's two bits for me that I think are most important responding to that question. One builds on what Luke's just said. We've got an ethical practice framework, and part of that certainly speaks to not just a initial consent, but the ongoing process of consent and the ability to withdraw that consent to participate, or to simply sit out part of a session if that session doesn't work, and then to re-engage at a point should they wish to. But again, with neither fear nor favour, go as you will. And also building in, if afterwards a particular child or young person says, actually, that was great and all, but I don't want you to use that anymore, then that's, it's certainly something that's open to them. The other side is the purposeful structuring of how we put together a consultation, whereby it doesn't require a child or young person, even if they have lived experience, to divulge any of that if they don't wish to, but to talk about, their understanding of, and that can well be informed by their own experience, but can also be what they've seen for others, as opposed to talking about their personal experience. And, many children, young people who've, got caught up not just in care and protection systems, but in the various other systems where, decision making is effectively taken away from them. They're keenly aware of what happens to others and not just themselves. A key point to make, I guess, though, is that, certainly if I think back to our family violence consultation in particular, I think what really garnered enthusiasm to some extent for the sharing of stories was that, and Luke, I think you touched on this, was that interest in seeing their experience change or lead to the potential for change, so that others who are coming behind them didn't have to go through the same thing. And so many children, young people shared their experiences because they wanted to make sure, as far as they could, that this wouldn't happen to other kids like them, and or because for many of them they had siblings as well, to try and make that change while their siblings were still in that space where they were exposed to that. And we very fortunately saw some great uptake of the outcomes of that consultation here, and I think also that's been quite influential nationally. But there's been some very deliberate policy changes, some very deliberate training changes, the establishment of a whole new program that Relationships Australia put together called Got Your Back, that I guess was built off the foundation of what we heard through that process, and that in and of itself continues to be guided by the young people who access that program in terms of its continued iteration. So yeah, it's certainly, I would absolutely agree, as you started, Luke. We very deliberately and mindfully design what we do, so that it's very much at the child or young person's choice, one, as to whether they engage at any point, but if they do engage, the extent to which they tell any personal part or personal experiences within that.
Jodie, can you just share with us a little more about some of those concrete outcomes? You talked about the uptake from the family violence consultations. Can you just share with us perhaps a couple more examples of how those consultations made a difference in terms of policy or systems?
Yeah, sure. Well, that's, that was a great example, and that's ongoing. We're also seeing a full training package that's in the course of development around making sure, I guess, that we embed that understanding of the children and young people's nuances and experiences within the way we understand and respond to not just children and young people, but also families and, parents, I guess, who are bringing up kids in that space. But I think back a few years ago, there was a proposed Year 7 health check that was being developed. And, we did again, we're small, we can only do small scale sometimes, but I think we had, 4 or 6 young people of the age that health check was going to be targeted to, participated in a bit of a consultation where we unpacked what was proposed and sought their views on how that, how that would be administered and implemented and all the rest of it. Certainly that process initially led to very much a withdrawing of okay, I think we need to take a few steps back and really relook at what this is and why we're doing this and what we serve to gain from this in terms of our understanding of children's health. And, and some of those things were really practical things in terms of who a child or young person would want in the room while they were being weighed and measured and asked about some of the key questions that were part of that. Things like, this isn't going to involve us lining up down the corridor like we have to do when we get our immunisations, is it? To that very real thing of, yeah, but what are you going to do with my information after you've got it? Who controls that? And I think those kind of nuances are the really important ones. Half the time, many adults may not, apart from those who, we all have to by rights of the privacy laws, et cetera, but many adults wouldn't think about some of those nuances as being things that kids would appreciate in terms of their understanding of privacy and their rights to actually have some of that information, or to be able to guide and direct who that information can be provided to. Those kind of things. It was really interesting as we reflected that back to ACT Health that, some of those considerations just hadn't been worked through as thoroughly as perhaps they could have been. Probably some of the other stuff we've seen last year when our second lockdown, sorry to those in Victoria, I know that was a continual process for you all, but for us, we had a moment of freedom in there. But in that second lockdown, we realised really quickly that none of the communications that were going out really considered or were targeted to children and young people, despite the fact that children and young people were seeing and hearing all the same things that we were as adults, but not receiving that through a lens that was matched to the different developmental levels and or capacities that they might have. And it was really pleasing. We jumped into the fray because it's like, okay, we can't see this going on for too long, and pivoted, became agile, all those great key phrases, but really flipped things around and went, well, we're going to start doing those targeted comms ourselves. We're going to start, we did newsletters, videos, anyone who's seen them, it was done on a Teams platform, very dodgy videography, no judgment, please. But they were hitting the mark, and we knew that they were hitting the mark when we were seeing things like the relevant minister in a daily briefing before the press, giving a shout out to children and young people and recognising that they were doing it tough, but also recognising their resilience and thanking them for doing what they were doing to keep themselves and others safe. We saw it through, the reach out from the Chief Minister himself to say, can you work with my comms people? We've got holidays coming up and kids are going to be in lockdown. Can you work with my comms people to give us some ideas about different things that children and young people might be able to do despite the current restrictions and those kind of things? So, I think each of those examples in different ways speaks to the kind of influence children and young people can have when given, the platform and mechanisms. I think, I don't know, I could probably go ahead. I think you've probably got a question down the track for us, no doubt, Sharon. But, how do we get from where we are to where we need to be, where it's not us as adults having to give kids that platform? I think that's a key question.
Luke, did you want to share any of your experiences around those kind of concrete outcomes?
Oh, just very briefly, and I'll draw on my previous role in the department as head of strategy and performance. So two things that I am uniquely proud of is having the children in care come to our executive board meeting every quarter, once a quarter, and talking to the CEO and the entire executive team around their lives. It really drew distinction between what the executives in charge of a child and family department thought were the key issues to what a 14-year-old struggling through school in his fourth foster care placement thought were the key issues. But the things that we did there was enable the children to design what we called the home plan. So a foster care house would have a document explaining how the house worked, who the members were, what the pet's name was, what the Wi-Fi code was. Young people designed the template. It had photos. What night is bin night? Do you get your own bedroom? Does the adult man in the house shower early or late? And, anything that the young people in the house thought was important, it went on the carer's file, and then any new child coming into that house would be given that booklet and would understand what they were going into before they arrived. We had a whole bureaucracy of forms and templates and practice guidance for staff, but it was a couple of young kids saying, no, what we just want is a little book, and then us trusting them to design it and then implementing it. It's a concrete, pragmatic resource that now exists because a department listened to and acted on, but also empowered young people to do something concrete. And I think we need to do more of that.
It was great too in Queensland a few years ago, and I saw it at a Create Foundation conference actually. There's a group of young people who were supported by the department up there to create the Kickbox app, Kids in Care box app, and it actually was co-designed with young people's input to be something where kids could hold their own information and own it, I guess, as a result of that. So it wasn't just about, the department staff being able to plug in, here's this and here's that, but, uploading all their key documents, birth certificates, Medicare cards, all that sort of stuff, but also enabling the young people to document their own history. Like, actually, I don't want to hear about, this, that, or the other about my educational status. I want you to know that at this age, I had a dog named Fred. What's important, and putting in photos and whatever else. So ultimately their history was owned by them. And again, I think that's, so strong in where we see agencies that can give that, hand over the reins, I guess, and give the control to children and young people and trust that the product will be something that will serve them well.
We've got lots of comments coming through the chat about what fantastic initiatives they are. So they're great to hear about. And I want to go back to some of our questions from people who've joined us. From Karen Hagan, she says, wondering if the Commission reviews, and Jodie, I think this is particularly referring to the work that you do in reviewing legislation and policy, wondering if the Commission reviews related to the human rights and wellbeing of refugee and asylum seeker children whose families have recently arrived. And so Jodie would be great to hear your thoughts on that, but perhaps more broadly around whether you have engaged with children and young people from who have been seeking asylum or are refugees.
Look, not specifically insofar as we don't have a remit in that sort of federal level as far as immigration, et cetera, goes, but certainly we've already heard through our partnership with the Multicultural Hub. We've got two partners with our racism consultation, one being the Multicultural Hub and the other being Coraggio, an Aboriginal controlled organisation. But certainly through the Multicultural Hub, we've already heard that there's a number of children and young people, both those who are culturally, linguistically diverse, but also some of those who are also in that space with uncertain immigration status or who are refugees who are interested in speaking to us. So while it's not been a targeted part of our work to date, it's certainly something that I think we will hear some interesting reflections come through that consultation. At a broader Commission level, however, certainly my colleagues regularly, we have a multicultural liaison officer as part of the Commission, not to put the burden entirely at his feet for supporting anyone who might approach the Commission, but he's a great source of guidance to the overarching Commission when we're responding to either complaints that have come up, potentially in that racism space, or because, there might be housing challenges or whatever it might be, but also in terms of those who are reporting themselves or as victims of crime in particular. So I think we certainly issues in relation to and challenges for that cohort certainly come to us at a broader commissioner level, or commission level, sorry. But I think for my role specifically, the racism consultation is where I think we will actually hear some of those really come out strongly in terms of the experiences.
Luke, is that something that your commissioner's been working around?
Not refugee, migrant children or families in particular, and it does go to something I'm currently considering 3 months into my role, and that is to what extent does the Queensland legislation enable the Children and Families Commission to touch, in a policy sense, a systemic sense, all families and children versus specific focus on the statutory systems. So I think that's a challenge for a lot of commissioners, is around where to focus resources. And in our federalist system of government, it is not easy or simple to say that only a few government departments impact on families. I've recently had very good meetings with the Department of Transport, Department of Employment and Business around the policy settings they have for Queensland's family and children. But I do worry if I have overstepped my legislative function, which is more narrowed to looking at the statutory systems that safeguard the wellbeing and safety of Queensland's children. And that's without even getting into federal policy making and federal departments. So it is a conversation I think all of Australia and New Zealand's children's commissioners have been having, and we should continue to have, and that is how do we bring a broad outcomes focused body of work for all families and children in Australia when we are fragmented into our Commonwealth, state and local government areas, and families are touched by so many different portfolios. And I think the great complexities of poverty, mental health, domestic violence, and the impact of colonisation don't sit neatly in one department or another. They are endemic across all of government's work.
Chris, I think that leads us into a question we have about kind of structural reform and the role of the commissioners from Chris Twomey. Chris says, interested to hear what we can do in structural reform to strengthen the role of children and young people's commissioners and the voices of children and young people, so that our reports to state parliaments on child wellbeing, child protection and justice issues are acted on. I wonder if either of you would like to comment on what kinds of structural reforms you might like to see, or what would support you better in your role to ensuring that there are those outcomes. Jodie, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, look,
it's a very big question.
It is. It's kind of like, where do you start? How long's a piece of string?
But maybe if there are one or two kind of key things you'd like to see us begin with.
Look, I might talk first for those who on the webinar who may not be aware. Both Luke and I and our colleagues also form a national, or it's actually slightly international. We go just over the channel of Australia and New Zealand Children's Commissioners and Guardians. So every Children's Commissioner, Children's Guardian, Children's Advocate within each of the states and territories here in Australia, as well as the New Zealand Commissioners, come together regularly, and it used to be in face-to-face, and now we're all online, but probably talking more frequently than we used to, I guess, identify and see if there's work we can do collectively to address some of those issues that do transverse all of our jurisdictions. And probably one of the first pieces of work that we did in that space since I've been in the seat, I'm not sure of things that might have happened before I came on 5 and a bit years ago, nearly 6. But we produced a set of standards for youth justice facilities and the operations of those. So that was sort of a collective piece of work. Different ways that we also utilise that group is by writing collectively, either at a federal level or in support of things at our local jurisdiction levels, where one of us might, put it out to our colleagues and say, hey, we've got this particular issue here. The position that as a group we've been adopting for some time is X. Would you be willing to support me in writing a letter to our, head of agency or whatever it might be, locally, and we've done it on a couple of occasions as well. So, we do, where we can, I guess, seek to create the space for a stronger collective influence than that which we might otherwise achieve individually, and or in addition to what we will seek to achieve individually, just to add some weight to it. And look, we've had some traction in some of those spaces. Some of that's come about through us writing to well, I mean, we even pitched one to the Prime Minister himself last year. But often what comes from that, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, it'd be nice if we did get meetings with those who are actually in those roles, but ultimately they tend to devolve that down a few levels. But we have had that opportunity to engage directly with those who are in the policy level of development of different reforms and strategies and all the rest of it, to provide our input as commissioners, children's commissioners, to whatever it is that's the focus at that particular time. So, I think that's probably a good point just to make at the outset. I don't think I'd even try and delve into what I think would be the key issues or even priority issues. Look, I think given the nature of this conversation, I would say that this in and of itself is probably a key priority issue. If we can gain increasingly more traction on with both local and federal political systems to actually understand that children and young people get these social issues. They get them at a level that sometimes is even better than us as adults, because they understand them in a way and with the nuances of children and young people's thinking that we just don't get. And I think too, when you've worked through bureaucratic systems for however long, you kind of get that knocked out of you. Don't think innovatively and creatively, just follow the policy line. And I've said a few times, children and young people are capable contributors and impressive innovators. They think differently, they understand the issues differently. And if we can hear what they're saying through their lens, not through our adult-centric lens, we will understand the issues at a far deeper level than we can ever grapple with talking about them around a policy table with a group of adults. And I think if we can get that traction with others going, we need to listen to children and young people. As kids say, we saw the school strike for climate change. They know that the decisions being made in the here and now, yep, they'll impact us as adults for a little while, but the people they're going to impact are our children and young people and their children and young people and those who are yet to come. It is that we're not going to see the impact of many of the decisions being made. The impact won't occur in our lifetime as adults. The true impact will come in the lifetimes of our children and young people. And Jodie, if that's not a good enough reason to listen to them, I don't know what is.
Jodie, you mentioned the climate strikes there. We've got a question in the Q&A about that. Sue Packer says,
hey,
I've recently been surprised in the conversation with child-aware professional colleagues quite heatedly objecting to children missing school to participate in climate rallies, stating strongly that they should be in school and not involved in such things. If the most informed in our community are so judgmental in their perception of intelligent, passionate young people, what measures do you think might help the general population think differently about the huge and legitimate capacities of young people? Luke, would you like to come in on that? It's a great question. Sue, of course, is an amazing advocate for children and young people.
Yeah. Well, can I take the easy way out maybe and say, well, why don't we ask the young people that? And and that's a little bit flippant of me, but maybe young people are protesting and not at school, and they are doing that because of their core beliefs, as Jodie's just so eloquently presented. And enlightened people or otherwise enlightened people are saying they shouldn't be doing that, they should be at school. It sounds to me like we're getting stuck on the ideology of the protest subject rather than potentially the actions of the young people. But I do think, at the end of this discussion where we are recognising and acknowledging that young people are engaged, do want to engage and do have solutions that we don't have, asking them around how would they change the narrative might be a very good body of work for commissioners to commission. But I do think that there's a whole number of policies within that question that need to be questioned. Having a young person attend a rally can be highly educational and potentially, dare I say it, far more educational than one day or half a day of schooling. So we need to always ask and be aware of what our young people are saying and doing, and if it is from their core beliefs, then I would say we need to support them rather than stop them.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. I think the naysayers in that space, I think, in my view, are possibly caught up on sort of very old school notions of education, as opposed to an understanding of learning. And I think your point about what can be learned there, not just about the issue at hand by talking to other like-minded, young people who might have similarly put their, feet to the ground and gone for the march, but also about the power of those processes in engendering the space for change. I was also reflecting as you were talking, if the experience of being in lockdown with COVID taught us anything about children and young people's learning, it taught us that doesn't always need to happen, and often can be far more effective for some in environments that aren't schools. And it's certainly something I've been reflecting on a bit about. We seem to have gone from the, you can do everything at home, no problems at all, you'll be fine, don't worry about it, it'll be the same as just when you're at school, and, albeit we know that wasn't the reality. But, we've gone straight from that to, okay, no, it's important you all need to be back behind your desks again and back in the classroom. There's a whole group of young children and young people out there who actually coped better with remote learning than they cope in classroom situations. So I think, Sue, I know I'm going a very, loop around off the topic of climate change, but I think we need to start thinking differently about how we approach learning for children and young people. How do we work creatively with the curriculum to provide opportunities that enable children and young people to build the knowledge and skills that they require as part of that curriculum package? And I think of one of the local schools here, one of our alternative education settings here, where, and I think it happens in schools generally as well, so it's not limited to them, but the entire curriculum is shaped around the young person choosing a topic or subject that they're interested in and going down a project inquiry kind of process. And the teachers are the support staff, really. They're not the leaders of it. The young person is the leader, and the teachers then look at how do they incorporate maths or science or English or whatever it happens to be into that inquiry process, so that all of those things that they need to learn are happening, but they're not the driving force for that piece of work. But yeah, they're still getting the same outcomes from that, albeit in different ways.
Agree. And I think that brings us back to the word engagement. And a society cannot prosper if its young people are not engaged. And if young people are engaged in protesting on climate change, then I think we should celebrate the fact that they're engaged.
We've got several more fantastic questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to just go directly to them. There's another question from Sue, which we've talked about education and maybe the need to rethink education from a children and young people's perspective. I think this is a question that goes to how we might need to think about the workforce and employment from children and young people's perspective. But Sue asks, the younger the child, the greater the challenge to hear and learn from them in the many ways that affect their daily lives. Have you learned of the ways this can be better accomplished and be influential in determining how early childhood services are developed and function? We now talk confidently about the importance of early brain development, but critically analysing how effectively we consider this in childcare and education and health service for infants and young people is important to do. So Sue goes on to say, recent actions arising from the pandemic have relegated this group, young children, to being entirely their parents' responsibility and only important in their impact on their parents' involvement in the workforce. And I think that point Sue raises, that often when we hear early childhood education and care or childcare talked about, it's not as children's rights or as in children's interests, but it's about how do we free the burden that children place on parents so their parents can work. And that, of course, is a very problematic narrative, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Luke, would you like to comment on that?
Oh, I would just say I agree. I'm not sure I could add more to that answer.
The question in itself says a great deal, doesn't it?
It does.
Jodie, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I need to say, because I think that it's absolutely a valid point, and one of the things we flew the flag for during COVID was very much that we were counting numbers and figures of adults who were vaccinated. Though pleasingly here in the ACT, each time we dropped down a level, we changed our threshold, but still, but our the whole actually we can all go back to normal now. Still doesn't take into account that there's a whole cohort of kids under 5 who remain unvaccinated and who potentially therefore have a whole level of greater risk accorded to them as a result. And I've got staff with children in daycare settings, early childhood care settings, who the impact is on them. The COVID's gone, round and round a daycare centre, and my staff are, and fortunately I'm able to offer flexibility to enable them to work from home if they're able to, or to take time off if they can't. But that burden is still resting on their shoulders to have that child at home, or to bear the risk of sending them into a centre where they know that COVID's circulating. On the issue, I guess, children's participation, though, I do want to give a bit of a shout out. There are some centres out there, I couldn't tell you how many, but who I think do an excellent job of child-led inquiry through the way that they design their programs. So I don't want to bag them all out. But again, I think that's something, how do they share those learnings so that they take colleagues along for the ride, or newcomers who, new grads who've entered into the setting along for that ride, to understand how the benefits of child-led inquiry can lead to more inquisitive learners and kids who adopt an early love of learning and ability to critically challenge a world that's, predominated by adults when you're at that age. In a way that serves them well. And I think that's, kudos to those who do that well.
We've got a question in the Q&A that relates to, which shifts the direction of the conversation just a little bit, but in a really important issue that Louise asks. She asks, the Aboriginal child placement principle is implemented at different levels across the country. How can or do you engage with Aboriginal youth in best practices and ways that we can implement the 5 cores more consistently across all jurisdictions? And I'm not sure how much this directly relates to the work that you do, but I wonder if either of you would like to comment on Louise's question.
I'd love to have some of our fellow commissioners on the table. I again go to the whole point of self-determination, in that, having me speak to that as a non-Indigenous commissioner when I have fellow commissioners who are able to apply that cultural lens far more strongly than me, would be more appropriate. Having said that, it absolutely remains integral to my own operations as commissioner. I don't separate my own responsibility in that space from those of my colleagues. And it's certainly in our work here, particularly in my public advocate hat, to put that one on, where we have that oversight of care and protection, but also the ability to intervene in care and protection processes. Challenging that on a regular basis, not just, that the core placement element of the principle, which seems to be the only one that's consistently incorporated in legislation across jurisdictions, but to actually have care and protection staff and others understand the breadth of the principle and its 5 elements, and to challenge and question and interrogate the extent to which each of those elements is actually being applied in the process of decision making, right from the very early touch point. And that touch point may not always be care and protection. That touch point is often another system that, in my view, still holds that responsibility for drawing upon the principle in the early conversations and engagements that are had with the child, the young person and their family, in a way that is culturally respectful and that recognises the integrity and both of culture, but of family within culture, to seeking guidance and advice and understanding the perspectives and cultural elements, I guess, of the way that decisions are made within that family unit and within that cultural group, within community, impressing upon people that this isn't a care and protection only principle is part of what we seek to do in our work, and really to, as I said, to challenge at every step of the way.
I absolutely echo that. I think that's critical. We have across Australia placed the child placement principle into child safety legislation, and here in Queensland, Commissioner Lewis, my co-commissioner, is leading the principal focus body of work, a multi-year review, but it's more analysis and policy testing around what is the drivers and the dynamics of overrepresentation of First Nations people in our statutory systems. And just this week, she spoke to our oversight committee in Parliament, and one of the critical factors that echoes what Jodie's just said is sometimes we need to also talk about underrepresentation of First Nations people in the universal and secondary support systems that do assist families to stay out of the statutory system. And so I think back in answer to the question, our principal focus program is us as a commission looking at the policies, practices, procedures of the statutory systems, but it is including, as I said earlier, talking to young people who have found themselves in youth detention settings. It is talking to the parents of children who have been removed to try and understand the life trajectory and what could have been done earlier or what did not work earlier that has led to overrepresentation in our system. And I think through that, and in the context of today's webinar, finding the voice of young people, both current and those from decisions of the past, to help guide our future work is so important. And what we will be doing with that work will include providing it to the department, who are currently implementing a delegated authority reform agenda to empower Aboriginal organisations to take control of the important decision-making around First Nations children when they do come into contact with the statutory system. So I think I agree with everything that's just been said. It does come back to finding the voice, amplifying the voice, and connecting that voice to the decision makers. And that's a large body of work that won't be easily done, but it's also one of the most important bodies of work I think we could do as Australia heading towards reconciliation.
Thank you both. I think they're both such powerful issues that you're raising, and I can see in the chat, people agreeing with the comments that you're making. I think this is a conversation that we could keep having for a very long time. We are almost at 2:30, so we're going to need to wrap it up. And my apologies to the couple of people whose questions weren't asked. Please come back to another webinar and we'll make sure we get to your questions. I did want to just draw this to a close with what is probably a very big question, but to ask you for your kind of shorter response. We've just seen a budget come down. We're about to move into an election campaign, and we will have an election in May. We're also coming out of COVID. So we are at a point where we can think differently about the world, think differently about our future. From your experience, from the work that you do, there are many things I'm sure that you could say need to happen in Australia or in your own state or territory to put children and young people genuinely at the centre. But what is the one thing that you would like to see happen in the short term so that children and young people are genuinely at the centre of all that we do, and particularly of policy and decision making? It's a tricky question to end on, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Luke, would you like to lead on?
Yeah, I'll have a go. And there is no silver bullet or magic bullet. It's effort and consciousness and self-reflection. But what I keep hearing from young people, and it's a word I don't hear in the bureaucracies of government, is the word hope. And I just think that's a wonderful measuring stick for any decision a government could make in the current world where we have war and COVID and federal election. Does this decision, does this policy give children hope for the future? And I just think if we couldn't hear from a child or children themselves on that question, we should definitely ask ourselves. And I think that's the type of question that does put the child at the centre of decision making.
Thanks, Luke. That's fantastic. Thank you. Jodie.
I might similarly go to a quote, and I'm going to take a liberty with the quote, but I will reflect back to the consultation I did with Aboriginal children and young people. And I remember one of the young people saying, it's okay to not know about what being Aboriginal means. It's not okay to not ask. And without wanting to take away from the importance of that quote in terms of the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, I think we could broaden that to all children and young people. You know, it's okay to not know what a child or young person might think, feel, experience about something. It's not okay to not ask.
Thank you both. That was a difficult question to end on. They were incredibly powerful answers. So thank you. And we will need to draw this to a close. A reminder to people who are listening that the recordings from this webinar series are available on our website. We'll be back next week and we'll be picking up on an issue that we did touch on today. So Wednesday, the 6th of April at 1 o'clock, Luke's colleague, Natalie Lewis, who Luke referred to, who is the Commissioner with the Queensland Family and Child Commission, will be with us talking about prioritising the rights and interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. So please do join us for that. That's going to be a really important conversation, and we're delighted to be able to have that conversation with Natalie. And also letting you know that our good friends at the Diplomacy Training Program at the University of New South Wales will be talking with both Luke and Natalie and Justice Yue Clarence Nelson, a member of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, about advancing children's rights via the UN reporting process. That webinar is this Friday at 1 p.m. It promises to be an excellent webinar, and the link to that is on our chat. So there's a lot happening at the moment around progressing children's human rights, and we thank everyone here today for being part of these conversations, for your excellent questions and comments. And I really want to thank you, Jodie, and you, Luke, so much for joining us today. That was a wonderful conversation. And thank you so much for the work that you do and for leading the way on these issues. Thank you, everyone.